what I'll do today is just give you a telescopic sense of what I'm engaged in. And then toward the end, I'll connect it to the exhibit outside this hall. I chose a title that would just make it easier for me to make that connection. The notion of ecology is critical. You don't have to see it in terms of natural ecology. You have to see it in terms of, first of all, when it comes to language, the fact that the body and the mind are essential parts of that ecology for communication. And then later on in modern history, and that must have been that way too before, you have to factor in socioeconomic pressures, how we make adjustments and so forth. And there are a number of other things that you may consider part of that ecology. And the way we go about it is that you see this representation of human evolution, or hominin evolution to be more specific. But I'll start by asking you a question. Do you see anything wrong with the representation? It's a classic representation. You find it in many publications, but when you look carefully at it, there is something wrong. Not just something, 2 or 3 things that are wrong. The first is that it suggests that humanity is whitening. That's a very dangerous assumption. And you can tell that modern theories of evolution started in the 19th century, when the rest of the world outside Europe was being colonized by Europeans. And Europeans thought that they were superior to all other human beings, and that they were, at the front line of evolution. And if anything, colonization intended to just change people culturally, try to Europeanize them, not always deliberately, but at least in the actions that the colonizers engaged in. And then the white color was supposed to be the best color, and so that's what the evolution should be proceeding toward. No wonder that among those of us that are darker, there have been some sick people trying to whiten the skin and so forth. But anyway, there's something else that is bizarre about the representation. It's male-dominated. Okay, it's just women had no role to play with it, and yet we know that reproductively it cannot just be men alone or women alone and so forth, but the default has been the white human person, the white male person. Okay, and then you can see other things. But the idea here is that our morphological and mental structures have been changing over time. And the distance here from here to there is about 6 million years. And from this guy that was the first tool maker, Homo habilis, to Homo sapiens, it took 2,500,000 years and so forth. And we appeared just about 400,000 years ago as we, ancestors of Homo sapiens, and the ancestors of Homo sapiens were probably not like us mentally. So anatomically, we could have been predisposed to develop spoken language, but mentally we were not ready until we reached this particular stage. Okay? And so accounts of how human language emerged should factor these particular considerations in, like ruling out the possibility that 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, when we started with language, that primordial language must have been very different from the modern languages that we speak. because mentally we were going to go through other kinds of evolution. And the critical part of it is the structure of the brain. Okay? First, we develop a larger cortex, which is different from what we find in other primates. And the shape of the brain itself had to change to become more globular. And so, if we are looking for any antecedent to a modern human language, we should probably go about 100,000 years ago, rather than that far back in history. Although, according to people like Philip Lieberman, who a neurolinguist who did a lot of research on that, the capacity to produce the different kinds of vowels can go as far back as 400,000 years ago. But producing those sounds is not the same thing as producing speech. Okay, and how we went from domesticating our animal vocalizations to speech sounds took several 100,000 years, and we don't quite know how that started. I'm not going to go into those details because we don't have enough time. Okay? And in the meantime, the way I represent it, the mind got in control of the body and domesticated different aspects of our anatomy for communication. Communication has always been there because it's pervasive in nature. We find it in other animals. We find it in plants too. But it's the kind of domestication, adaptation of our organism that would produce explicit kind of communication. We wanted a form of communication that is more and more explicit. And it's never precise. If it were precise, we wouldn't be able to handle languages. Okay. But also the kind of communication that is high fidelity. So we often have to communicate in noisy environments. And in noisy environments, we learn to tune up to the speaker. I'm going to talk mostly about spoken language. That's what I know the best about. And so you can ignore the rest of the noise and focus on speech sounds especially. And we often think that when we are in a crowded space, the louder we speak, the better. Sometimes the louder we speak, the less we hear each other. Okay, so these are things that we have to pay attention to. We must have gone through a lot of trials and errors, okay, eliminating alternatives that don't work and so forth, and eventually all human populations around Africa managed to develop a spoken language. Okay. In literature, we usually speak of the evolution of language or the evolutionary emergence of language, but that's in reference to the common properties of the different languages that are spoken around the world. It's not that we have to subscribe to the biblical story of starting with one language and then that language diversified into several different languages. Okay, according to the book of Genesis, multilingualism is a curse, so that we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. Look how things have evolved. Now we value diversity, we value variation, and we don't want to interpret it as a curse, but we consider it as a meaningful to capture variation among us human beings. And coming to how the languages are structured, they vary from one community, from one culture to another culture. That is evidence that for many problems, we don't have to come with one solution. And one thing that school has done the wrong way is that you give a homework to students, and they come back with different kinds of answers, and the teacher has made their choice, and everything else is wrong. It's not really nurturing adequate thinking because there is no solution that is really perfect. And we operate on satisfying solutions that can work for the problems that we face, but that may not work under different kinds of conditions and so forth. Okay, and the pressures to which we respond vary. Anyone that has taught a class knows this. You prepare your notes as a teacher, and you teach the class and so forth, and you ask questions, listen to variation in the ways that people answer your questions and so forth. Okay, not because some are stupid and others are more intelligent, but because minds just operate in, differing ways. Okay, and so we don't quite know how far ago it was, but generally we estimate 50 to 30,000 years ago, but you see a date there that can suggest about 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens dispersed out of Africa. And what I want to capture here is the fact that although we dispersed out of Africa, it was not like we had a general telling us this group goes left, that other group goes east, and the other group goes north. Okay? And we didn't all disperse out of Africa at the same time. And the conditions under which we dispersed out of Africa kept changing and so forth. And that is very interesting. But guess what? Since then, we've been colonizing the world in different directions, including the migration that brought some people back to Africa. And the people that came back to Africa is not just Europeans coming to colonize Africa, but also people like the Afro-Asiatic populations that came back to Africa about 3,000 years ago, long before Europeans ever dreamed of colonizing Africa and so forth. You have to think of the Hellenic Empire, where the Greeks also settled trade colonies on the north coast of Africa, and later on the Romans that did the same, using the Greek trade routes and expanding them. So there have been all these migrations. And what does it mean that human populations speaking different languages came in contact with each other too? Okay? And that then they had to negotiate about how to communicate with each other. And very often what happened, the population that is more powerful economically or politically or militarily wound up imposing its language, and the other populations learn that language to communicate. But in some other cases, as we learn in history, people didn't always shift languages. Okay, and this we see, for instance, in Africa, contrary to the Americas, where in the Americas, first of all, let's take Anglophone North America, okay, the present-day United States and Canada. Continental Europeans gave up their languages in favor of English, okay? And then the Quebecois fought back for their language, and they managed to maintain it. Francophones in Louisiana were not that smart or that fortunate because they didn't live in the right ecologies to protect French, and French is dying in Louisiana. In some places such as Maine, French is dead already. But what has attracted our attention the most now is the fact that Native Americans have been losing their languages. Okay? And these are all aspects of colonization. And you can interpret these cases of language shifts in terms of adaptations to changing socioeconomic structures. Okay? And the Quebecois succeeded because in order to revitalize French in Quebec, they had to empower French economically, making sure that businesses in Quebec operate in French too, making sure that the wages for the Francophones are competitive with the wages of the Anglophones and so forth. And that way, if you are a Francophone in Quebec, you can refuse to speak English and still earn a decent living. Okay? What has happened in the case of Native Americans, land disposition disempowered them. Okay? And then land disposition pushed them to through land dispositions, they were pushed to what we now call reservations. And the reservations are usually in plots of land that are economically less sustainable. Okay? But another thing very significant happened, that the population of Native Americans has been reduced to a negligible minority. It's not like when the Arabs colonized Spain and Portugal, Iberia, and they stayed there for 7th century. But by the 7th century of that colonization, the Spaniards and the Portuguese got control of their land and could reclaim it through the Reconquista. And one of the reasons is they never became a minority in their own lands. Okay? And that's the situation for a lot of Africans now. In Africa, the indigenous populations are not economically that powerful, but they have remained the dominant majority, and they can continue operating in traditional economic systems. You know, there's territory where you can count the unemployment rate up to 60 or 70% of the population, something that you wouldn't think about in North America. Okay, and that has exclusion from the modern economy has enabled Africans to maintain their languages, whereas the conditions of Native Americans are such that they don't have that choice. Okay. Okay, I had forgotten to project that. Sorry. Okay. Have these things happened before? Yes. Okay. So in this map here, you see colonization within Africa, some Africans by other Africans. And in this case, the Pygmies relative to the Bantu population, the Khoisan relative to the Bantu populations, and the Bantu started the expansion outside their homeland about 5,000 years ago. And little by little, they went first around the rainforest and eventually through the rainforest or around the desert here, the Kalahari, and eventually penetrated it. What happened? The Pygmies started shifting their languages to the Bantu languages. The Bantu populations were farmers and brought iron technology, and the Pygmy populations were hunter-gatherers and so forth. I don't know what else happened, but it so happens that I think except for one or two, the Pygmy languages are all dead now. Okay? So don't see economic pressures in terms of modern economic pressure. There could be traditional economic pressures that force you to change your lifestyle and so forth. And the Pygmies haven't really changed their lifestyle that much, except that they needed better arrows. And with iron technology that gave the Bantu population advantage, but they also taught the Bantu population techniques for hunting in the rainforest, okay? And that worked in favor of the Bantu populations. And then here in southern Africa, the Khoi and San people were either herders or hunter-gatherers. Okay, and when the Bantu populations came, and there were unions between Khoi and San women and Bantu males, not the other way around. And then little by little, the more they interacted with the Bantu populations, the more they gave up on their languages. Not all of them. Unlike the Pygmy population, Khoi and San people have maintained some of their languages. And here is also the area where you get a collision between the European expansion and the Bantu expansion. Have you heard of the Shaka Zulu episodes? There's an instance of the clash between the European expansion and the Bantu expansion. Okay, and so that too had a toll on the Khoi and San languages, but not all of them are dead, as in the case of the Pygmy populations. Okay. Now, something more interesting to many of you, the Indo-European expansion. Okay, and so just looking at the history, don't take it for the actual routes of expansions and so forth, but just reading the history of wars among Europeans and imperial expansion and so forth, I came up with this speculative map, and then the Proto-Indo-Europeans started dispersing. And not all of them arrive at the destination at the same time. So, and I wanted to present this here on the model of cluster bombs, where there are secondary points of dispersal and so forth, just to show the extent to which some Indo-European populations establish roots elsewhere, and from there they also disperse in different parts of Europe and so forth. And it looks like the Celts got everywhere before other Western Europeans. And then little by little, first the Hellenic developed their empires. But the Greeks, ancient Greeks, they were not so successful in imposing their language, except for the language of scholarship and the language of prestige. That's for the elite class. Guess what? Read the history of ancient Greeks. It's about the elite class, not about the common people. Okay? And then the Roman expansion, and that one had serious linguistic consequences, to the extent that a lot of Celtic languages died and were replaced by Vulgar Latin, but Vulgar Latin won a Pyrrhic victory in that it was transformed by the languages that it had displaced, and then we speak of the Romance languages. But the interesting thing is, here you see the extent to which the Roman Empire expanded. The blue lines represent the places where the Greeks had settled their trade colonies, but the Roman Empire was also in part a set of trade colonies and so forth. But for one reason, we have to explain why there are no Hellenic languages to speak of, in the same ways that we can speak of the Romance languages. But the other thing is that it's only the western part of Europe that became Romance territory, not the eastern part, and yet the eastern part overlasted the western part by 1,000 years. And we find out that in the eastern part, the Romans themselves preferred Greek. Didn't I tell you it was the culture of the elite class? Greek was more prestigious, and the Romans in the Eastern Empire used Greek as the language of administration. But in the Western Empire, they used Latin. And when you put things in perspective, actually, Latin started spreading in the Western Empire after the Western Empire had collapsed. And the driver is that the Western Empire the former Western Empire had preserved the Roman socio-economic structure and developed the economy in the model of Roman economy, built the trade centers which would become the modern cities in the style of Rome. And then little by little, over 1,000 years, the territories would become Roman-speaking, but England didn't. And yet England was colonized by the Germanic populations at the same time that Gaul was colonized by the Germanic populations. But what happened is very interesting. The Franks who colonized Gaul preferred Latin to their own language, whereas the Saxons and Angles and Jats who colonized England maintained their own languages. Actually, they kept themselves for a while apart from the Celtic populations, and out of the contact of the Germanic languages brought from continental Europe, English was born 2 centuries later, from between the 5th and the 7th century. So this is interesting. So we have to follow these things very carefully, and it helps a lot to read the history of the different parts of the world, what were the dynamics of interactions that have produced what we know today. Okay? But then there's something interesting too, because in the eastern part, I think here, Romania became Romance, and the surrounding territories didn't. Okay, there are a lot of questions that we have to find answers for, and I just keep, exposing these, divergent situations, what kinds of explanations they call for. Okay, but throughout all this, it's a matter of whether you are adapting yourself to the changing socioeconomic pressures, or you are excluded from them, and while you are excluded from them, you can maintain your traditional ways. Okay? So, suppose Native Americans had remained on the reservations, and the reservations were socioeconomically competitive with the rest of the United States, we would be talking about a different kind of history. And now when we think of empowering Native Americans, they build casinos. What happens? The clientele is Anglophone. And in economics, people speak of the buyer's language. And therefore, you have to accommodate your clientele and speak English. That is not the kind of economic empowerment that is going to revitalize a language. Okay, you should build a kind of economy that would enable Native Americans to function competitively in their own languages, but that is difficult because the population has been reduced to that tiny of minority. Okay, without a strong critical mass to sustain the language, and people have to keep moving out of the reservations into the mainstream. And once you do that, you do precisely what continental European immigrants have been doing. You read the history of North America. Until the 19th century, whites as a category didn't exist. There were different national communities, and they had their own parochial economic system. They had their parochial schools and so forth, until it became unsustainable to keep up these parochial economic systems. And the human being is there to survive and find solutions. And what is the best thing? You join the group that is economically the most powerful, and they function in the economic system. And the language of the economic system, you use it first of all as a lingua franca, and then little by little the lingua franca function becomes redundant. The lingua franca prevails, but the what people call now heritage languages, the national languages brought from continental Europe, become redundant. Okay, and then the lingua franca permeates the home and starts functioning as a lingua franca. So now German is a memory, Italian is a memory, Norwegian is a memory, and you keep counting. Hungarian is memory, and so forth. They disappear little by little. Okay. This is my way of fighting racism in the way that we talk about language endangerment and loss, because the literature that I know focuses so much on Native Americans, sometimes coming up with reasons that are ridiculous, like Native Americans have lost pride in their cultural heritage, which is not true. Work with poor people, you will see how much pride they have in their heritage and how frustrated they are that they cannot maintain it. Okay. Or that Native Americans have lost shifted to the most prestigious language. Europeans that shifted to English, they didn't necessarily shift to the more prestigious language. Besides, if you follow the history, they learn colloquial English, not standard English. How many North Americans really speak standard English? Okay. So these are things that we have to bear in the picture, and you follow the way that people talk about indigenous people. It's in a new sense. It's not like people that are endemic to a particular territory, but people that have been colonized. Okay, it's embarrassing. Up to the United Nations, the term has been adopted this way. People publish things about indigenous people. For me, I ask the question, are there any indigenous people in Europe? When I travel to Europe, who am I supposed to consider as indigenous to Europe? Okay, so something isn't working quite well in this kind of scholarship, and people have to think hard about the terms that they are using to describe the different kinds of situations. Anyway, the situation I was trying to explain here, this is a map that one afternoon I decided to design, and then went and saw an expert that could draw a beautiful one for me. It's full of confusion too, but it represents the different groups of Europeans that migrated outside Europe. The Russians went eastward, but some Western European nations went westward and southwards. And I want to talk a little bit about this. This is New France. And New France was less populated, had fewer colonizers proportionally than the original 13 United States. Okay? And then little by little, the 13 United States became more and more powerful economically and decided to expand westward. And the French were trying to recover from the loss of Haiti. And they were broke. And Napoleon decided to sell part of New France south of Quebec to Americans. And that made a drastic change. The sale removed the Louisiana Purchase. You must have read about it. The sale opened the door for westward expansion for the United States, and the French became reduced to a status of minority group, especially in the parts that had been sold. So in Louisiana, for instance, French has survived the longest in the bayous of Louisiana until oil was discovered in the bayous, and a new industry would develop, an Anglo industry. And with the industry came the further expansion of of English, and little by little, French started ceding ground to English. Okay. Before that, it had been the cotton plantations that were brought to Louisiana to substitute for sugarcane plantations. The sugarcane plantations operated in French, the cotton plantations operated in English, and little by little, English prevailed, and French started receding, we say contracting. And these are interesting things to follow in history. But the whole history, if you see it, throughout all this, it's not that people don't like their cultures, it's not that people don't like their traditions, but they want to survive in the changing socioeconomic structures. If that means that unwillingly you are going to forget your own languages and some of your traditions, so be it. That's how people go. Okay, and in the history of the world, this is what you see all over. And the difference that I wanted to highlight between Africa and the Americas is that the Americas was colonized in the settler style, where Europeans wanted to create new Europes. Okay? Whereas in Africa, they didn't want to create new Europes. Actually, the colonization of Africa started in earnest in the second half of the 19th century, when you put things in perspective, now that we talk about globalization. If the United States didn't go through its revolution, if Haiti didn't go through its revolution, then European metropoles wouldn't have sought for alternatives for raw materials. As the United States went through the revolution, it was, we develop ourselves. We don't want to pay tribute to the crown of England anymore, and so forth. This coincided with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, and the European metropoles needed raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Was the solution? Let's go and colonize Africa, but in a different style, not as settlers. We're going to be as extractors of raw materials and care very little about the development, the general economic development of Africa. Okay, in the words of Walter Rodney, Guyanese, now dead, Africa is a continent that paid for its own underdevelopment. Okay, and so these differences in style of colonization, and whether or not you are going to include the indigenous people in your economic development, makes a whole lot of difference regarding whether you are going to, the colonized populations can maintain their languages or are doomed to lose their languages. Okay. So, and the other part of it is that we have been, as Homo sapiens, we have been a population in migrations all the time. Okay. And so we colonize other territories. And here you have to see colonization under two interpretations. One is that you relocate to a new territory and you domesticate it. Okay. And the other sense is that where you relocate, you find a population that preceded you. But you are powerful enough to dominate the indigenous population, and you change that indigenous population. Okay? And both things have been happening. Okay? And in both situations, if you went to a place that didn't have that was uninhabited, like in Cape Verde, like in the Falkland Islands, and so forth, you just rearrange things, but you have to adapt to the new natural ecology. Okay? But although nominally you come from the same nation, but you come from different parts of the homeland, so the colony becomes an arena of contact where competition obtains from different contributions of the homeland. And you develop a new culture in the colony that is different from that of the homeland, and so forth. And so you see new language varieties emerge that just don't sound like the language varieties that were spoken in the homeland. Okay. And and where no particular population made a concession to the other linguistically, the languages nonetheless went through changes because people adapted to the concepts of the other populations, to words that used in the other population that they didn't have in their own, and so forth. So people borrow from each other. And part of the history of the world is that there is no particular population that has had the monopoly of inventing everything, and everybody else copies from them. Okay? So you take the history of Europe, for instance. Where did paper come from? Where did the compass come from? Where did indoor plumbing come from? Where did what we call modern medicine come from? Not from Europe, from Asia. Okay? If you have ever visited mainland China, especially the Forbidden City in Beijing, you will find out that Europe was in the darkness when mainland China was technologically more advanced than Europe. The Europeans invented the caravel after the Chinese had already invented the junk ship, because they were trading along the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and the Europeans couldn't go beyond the Mediterranean at that time. Okay, so these are interesting things to notice in history. Okay, and Christianity that has pervaded the world and was spread around the world mostly by Europeans didn't start in Europe either. Okay, so we have lived in conditions where, as migrants, we adapt to the new natural ecologies, where we adapt to the new populations that we come in contact with, and so forth. Unfortunately, history is typically written by the victor, and we hear only part of the history. But if you read these historical accounts very closely, you're going to find that we have been naturally borrowing from each other. And in some cases, of course, we have borrowed so much that our own indigenous cultures kind of disappeared in a way. Okay? And when you travel to Africa and you consider the difference in the kind of socioeconomic embedding of colonization, then you notice that if you are integrated in the new socioeconomic system, it is harder for you to keep your ancestral ways, but if you are not integrated, it's easier for you to stick to your ancestral ways. And in some cases, it's a matter of whether you can buy what the other population has to offer. And if you cannot afford it, but then you better make it do with your traditional ways and so forth. And what is important in all these cases of colonization, which is the whole world, new population structures produce new cultural practices and artifacts, including modern technologies and sciences, in the form of either adaptation or innovations, and many of them starting as borrowings and involving hybridization. So all modern cultures are hybrid. There is no pure European culture, there is no pure Muslim culture, there is no pure Bantu culture anymore, because there have been all these adaptations to one another. Nor is there pure Chinese culture either. Okay. So the history of English is a way where we can find traces of all these things. For instance, when it comes to food, terms that are not Germanic, that we find in English: pork, beef, gâteau, chariot, and many other words from French. Also the word double entendre, the right way, I forgot to italicize that part. Okay? They come from French especially. And the history goes that because of the social stratification that obtained in England after the Norman conquest, okay, the rulers didn't have to deal with the pig or with the cow, and so they identify the food items by French names, and so these items eventually spread in the population, and so you don't have the kind of alternation that you, in terms of meaning, that you find with other food items, the difference between I ate chicken and I ate a chicken. You can say both, right? But with different meanings. I ate duck and I ate a duck with a lot of appetite. So these are interesting to bear in mind. And gâteau was an introduction of the French cuisine. So you find it too is more than a cake. It's a different kind of thing. And then from the other colonies, the term banana, mango, papaya, avocado, maize, that comes from the languages of the colonies, because colonization coming with a worldwide globalization, that is more and more traffic between the colonies and the metropole, and the traffic was not only of human beings, traffic also was of commodities from the tropics especially, and with these commodities came the names used in the colonies. By adaptations, the words were absorbed into the English language, and nowadays we don't have to think of them. We can complain about the mango not being ripe enough in the grocery store when you buy it. I complain all the time. But the words are there to tell you that history. And then you go to the Caribbean, and the words have spread around the world too. The hybridization of music practices. Instruments from predominantly Europe, but rhythm from Africa. Okay? And then you can factor in social class too. Jazz for the elite class and blues for the common people in the history of the United States. Okay? And then reggae in the Caribbean for the average person, calypso too, soca too, and these things change. And you have to be careful because a lot of people say, these are African contributions alone. You cannot say that because the instruments are not African. Okay? And we also know that the same melody, if you change the instrument, is going to sound different. If you try to play the national anthem of the United States on different instruments, you are going to hear different things. If you pay attention, depending on who sings the national anthem at a big ceremony, the national anthem sounds different. These are important considerations. It tells you the power of the ecological approach if you want to explain a number of things. Okay? And in some other cases, we just use an old term and give it a new meaning. And they coexist. So people my age must know that in the late 80s and the 1990s, people were wondering whether we should use mice or mouses for the plural of the computer mouse. Right? And eventually people settle on mice because it's just easier or whatever than mouses. Sounds ridiculous. And then for some people, the mouse is not just the external technology that you use, but even the pointer. They can call it mouse. So that's interesting. And then fire. We have firewalls in computers. Okay? And take hall, like in Hall of Fame, the meaning of hall changes. And by the time you get to dance hall music and so forth, the meaning of hall also is modified and so forth. And then paint, as we are dealing with painting today, okay, is no longer just covering a surface with a uniform color, but producing images on canvas is also painting, and that is something. Or rollover, are we going to roll over the balance of your account? Are we going to ignore it? Okay, so these are the adaptations that we make quite naturally and so forth. It's part of the essence of our survival. Okay, and we have to satisfy our communication needs too, and very often it's just easier to take what is in use already rather than to try to coin new terms and so forth. And speaking of that, imagine terms that are no longer used and we say those words are dead. Okay? So I believe that distortions in Jules Verne's art are adaptations to how she conceived of the subjects or objects at the moment she created the different pieces. Okay? Because this is just a natural way of doing it, and she did it with art. Visual art is not necessarily photographic. Okay? And even perception is not that objective. Perception is really subjective. We can look at the same thing and yet conceive of it differently. I had cartoons drawn on my face, and a cartoon drawn by a German is different from a cartoon drawn by a Black American. Okay, my nose, my lips are represented differently depending on the perception and on the biases that exist there, you know. And so creative visual art does precisely the same thing. Even photographers manipulate their cameras to enhance some specific perspective on the subjects or objects, and so do cartoonists. Okay? And these distortions or adaptations are similar to how we extend meanings of words we use to meet our communicative needs, and that is part of adaptation. Okay, I don't think this is part of the exhibit today, but the different ways in which Martin Luther King is represented. Okay, what was she thinking when she chose one image rather than the other kind of image, and so forth? And we are more complex than we credit ourselves with. Okay, and we do these kinds of things. And so I thank you for your attention, and thank you for having me here.